Volume 2, Book 6, Chapters 21 through 30 of The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus. Translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 6, Chapter 21. Let us, said Vespasian, tackle the subject, for it is one very suitable to men, whether they are wise or not. But lest we should drag in the opinions of Indians, and so confuse our discussion, and go off without having formed any conclusions, do you first impart to us the views held by the Indians concerning justice, for you probably examined their views on the spot. And if their opinion is proved to be correct, we will adopt it, but if we have something wiser to put in its place, you must adopt our view, for that too is plain justice. Said Apollonius, Your plan is excellent and most satisfactory to me. So do you listen to the conversation which I held there. For I related to them how I had once been the captain of a large ship, in the period when my soul was in command of another body, and I thought myself extremely just, because, when robbers offered me a reward, if I would betray my ship by running it into roads where they were going to lie in wait for it, in order to seize the cargo, I agreed and made the promise just to save them from attacking us, but intending to slip by them and get beyond the place agreed upon. Vespasian said, And did the Indians agree that this was justice? No, they laughed at the idea, he replied, for they said that justice was something more than not being unjust. It was very sensible, said the other, of the Indians to reject such a view, for good sense is something more than not entertaining nonsense, just as courage is something more than not running away from the ranks. And so temperance is something more than the avoidance of adultery, and no one reserves his praise for a man who has simply shown himself to be not bad. For because a thing, no matter what, is equidistant between praise and punishment, it is not on that account to be reckoned offhand to be virtue. How then, O Vespasian, said Apollonius, are we to crown the just man, and for what actions? Could you have discussed justice more completely and more opportunely, said the other, than when the sovereign of so large and so flourishing a country intervened in your philosophic discussion of the art of kingship, a thing intimately connected with justice? If it had been Phraotes, said Apollonius, who turned up on that occasion, you might rightly blame me for not gravely discussing the subject of justice in his presence. But you know from the account which I gave of him yesterday, that the man is a drunkard and an enemy of all philosophy. What need, therefore, was there to inflict on him the trouble? Why should we try to win credit for ourselves in the presence of a Sybarite who thinks of nothing but his own pleasures? But inasmuch as it is incumbent upon wise men like ourselves to explore and trace out justice, more so than on kings and generals, let us proceed to examine the absolutely just man. For though I thought myself just in the affair of the ship, and thought others just too, because they did not practice injustice, you deny that this in itself constitutes them just or worthy of honor. And rightly so, said the other, for who ever heard of a decree being drafted by Athenians or Lacedaemonians in favor of crowning so-and-so, because he is not a libertine, or of granting the freedom of a city to so-and-so, because the temples have not been robbed by him? Who then is the just man, and what are his actions? For neither did I hear of anyone being crowned merely for his justice, nor of a decree being proposed over a just man to the effect that so-and-so shall be crowned, because such and such actions of his show him to be just. For anyone who considers the fate of Palamedes in Troy, or of Socrates in Athens, will discover that even justice is not sure of success among men. For assuredly these men suffered most unjustly, being themselves most just. Still, they at least were put to death on the score of acts of injustice imputed to them, and the verdict was a distortion of the truth, whereas in the case of Aristides, the son of Lysimachus, it was very justice that was the undoing of him, for he, in spite of his integrity, was banished merely because of his reputation for this very virtue. And I am sure that justice will appear in a very ridiculous light, for having been appointed by Zeus and by the fates to prevent men from being unjust to one another, she has never been able to defend herself against injustice. And the history of Aristides is sufficient to me to show the difference between one who is not unjust and one who is really just. For tell me, is not this the same Aristides of whom your Hellenic compatriots, when they come here, tell us that he undertook a voyage to the islands to fix the tribute of the allies, and after settling it on a fair basis, returned again to his country, still wearing the same cloak in which he left it? It is he, answered Apollonius, who made the love of poverty once to flourish. Now, said the other, let us suppose that there were at Athens 2 public orators passing an encomium upon Aristides, just after he had returned from the allies. One of them proposes that he shall be crowned, because he has come back again without enriching himself or amassing any fortune. But the poorest of the Athenians, poorer than he was before. And the other orator, we will suppose, drafts his motion somewhat as follows. Whereas Aristides has fixed the tribute of the allies according to their ability to pay, and not in excess of the resources of their respective countries, and whereas he has endeavored to keep them loyal to the Athenians, and to see that they shall feel it no grievance to pay upon this scale, it is hereby resolved to crown him for justice. Do you not suppose that Aristides would himself have opposed the first of these resolutions as an indignity to his entire life, seeing that it only honored him for not doing injustice, whereas he might perhaps have supported the other resolution as a fair attempt to express his intentions and policy? For I imagine it was with an eye to the interest of Athenians and subject stakes alike that he took care to fix the tribute on a fair and moderate basis, and in fact his wisdom in this matter was conclusively proved after his death. For when the Athenians exceeded his valuations and imposed heavier tributes upon the islands, their naval supremacy at once went to pieces, though it, more than anything else, had made them formidable. On the other hand, the prowess of the Lacedaemonians passed on to the sea itself, and nothing was left of Athenian supremacy, for the whole of the subject states rushed into revolution and made good their escape. It follows then, O Apollonius, that, rightly judged, it is not the man who abstains from injustice that is just, but the man who himself does what is just, and also influences others not to be unjust. And from such justice as his there will spring up a crop of other virtues, especially those of the law court and of the legislative chamber. For such a man as he will make a much fairer judge than people who take their oaths upon the dissected parts of victims, and his legislation will be similar to that of Solon and of Lycurgus. For assuredly these great legislators were inspired by justice to undertake their work. Chapter 22. Such, according to Damis, was the discussion held by them with regard to the just man, and Apollonius, he says, assented to their argument, for he always agreed with what was reasonably put. They also had a philosophic talk about the soul, proving its immortality, and about nature, along much the same lines which Plato follows in his Timaeus. And after some further remarks and discussions of the laws of the Hellenes, Apollonius said, For myself, I have come all this way to see yourselves, and visit the springs of the Nile. for a person who only comes as far as Egypt may be excused if he ignores the latter, but if he advances as far as Ethiopia, as I have done, he will be rightly reproached if he neglects to visit them, and to draw, as it were, from their well-springs some arguments of his own. Farewell, then, said the other, and pray to the springs for whatever you desire, for they are divine. But I imagine you will take as your guide Timasion, who formerly lived at Neuratus, but is now at Memphis. For he is well acquainted with the springs of the Nile, and he is not so impure as to stand in need of further lustrations. But as for you, O Nilus, we would like to have a talk to you by ourselves. The meaning of this sally was clear enough to Apollonius, for he well understood their annoyance at Nilus's preference for himself, but to give them an opportunity of speaking to him apart, he left them to prepare and pack up for his journey, for he meant to start at daybreak. And after a little time Nilus returned, but did not tell them anything of what they had said to him, though he laughed a good deal to himself. And no one asked him what he was laughing about, but they respected his secret. Chapter 23. They then took their supper, and after a discussion of certain trifles, they laid them down to sleep where they were. But at daybreak they said goodbye to the naked sages, and started off along the road which leads to the mountains, keeping the Nile on their right side. And they saw the following spectacles deserving of notice. The Catadupi are mountains formed of good soil, about the same size as the hill of the Lydians called Tmolus, and from them the Nile flows rapidly down, washing with it the soil of which it creates Egypt. But the roar of the stream as it breaks down in a cataract from the mountains and hurls itself noisily into the Nile is terrible and intolerable to the ears, and many of those who have approached it too close have returned with the loss of their hearing. Chapter 24. Apollonius, however, and his party pushed on till they saw some round-shaped hills covered with trees, and leaves and bark and gum, of which the Ethiopians regard as of great value. And they also saw lions close to the path, and leopards, and other such wild animals. But they were not attacked by any of them, for they fled from them in haste, as if they were scared at the sight of men. And they also saw stags and gazelles, and ostriches and asses, the latter in great numbers, and also many wild bulls and ox-goats, so called, the former of these two animals being a mixture of the stag and the ox, that latter of the creatures from which its name is taken. They found, moreover, on the road the bones and half-eaten carcasses of these, for the lions, when they have gorged themselves with fresh prey, care little of what is left over of it, because, I think, they feel sure of eating fresh quarry whenever they want it. Chapter 25. It is here that the nomad Ethiopians live in a sort of colony upon wagons, and not far from them the elephant hunters, who cut up these animals and sell the flesh, and are accordingly called by a name which signifies the selling of elephants. And the Nasamones, and the man-eaters, and the Pygmies, and the shadow-footed people are also tribes of Ethiopia, and they extend as far as the Ethiopian Ocean, which no mariners ever enter except castaways who do so against their will. Chapter 26. As our company were discussing these animals and talking learnedly about the food which nature supplies in their different cases, they heard a sound as of thunder, not a crashing sound, but of thunder as it is when it is still hollow and concealed in the cloud. And Timasion said, "A cataract is at hand, gentlemen, the last for those who are descending the river, but the first to meet you on your way up." And after they had advanced about 10 stades, he says that they saw a river discharging itself from the hillside, quite as big as the Marsyas and the Maeander at their first confluence. And he says that after they had put up a prayer to the Nile, they went on till they no longer saw any animals at all, for the latter are naturally afraid of noise, and therefore live by calm waters rather than by those which rush headlong with a noise. And after 15 stades they heard another cataract, which this time was horrible and unbearable to the senses, for it was twice as loud as the first one, and it fell from much higher mountains. And Damis relates that his own ears and those of one of his companions were so stunned by the noise that he himself turned back and besought Apollonius not to go any further. However, he, along with Timasion and Nilus, boldly pressed on to the third cataract, of which he made the following report on his return. Peaks there overhang the Nile, at the most 8 stades in height, but the eminence faces the mountains, namely a beetling brow of rocks mysteriously cut away, as if in a quarry, and the fountains of the Nile cling to the edge of the mountain, till they overbalance and fall on to the rocky eminence, from which they pour into the Nile as an expanse of whitening billows. But the effect produced upon the senses by this cataract, which is many times greater than the earlier ones, and the echo which leaps up therefrom against the mountains, render it impossible to hear what your companions tell you about the river. But the further road which leads up to the first springs of the river was impracticable, they tell us, and impossible to think of, for they tell many stories of the demons which haunt it, stories similar to those which Pindar in his wisdom puts into verse about the demon whom he sets over these springs to preserve the due proportions of the Nile. Chapter 27. After passing the cataracts, they halted in a village of the Ethiopians of no great size, and they were dining towards the evening, mingling in their conversation the grave with the gay, when all on a sudden they heard the women of the village screaming and calling to one another to join in the pursuit and catch the thing, and they also summoned their husbands to help them in the matter. And the latter caught up sticks and stones and anything which came handy, and called upon one another to avenge the insult to their wives. And it appears that for 10 months the ghost of a satyr had been haunting the village, who was mad after the woman, and was said to have killed 2 of them, to whom he was supposed to be specially attached. The companions, then, of Apollonius were frightened out of their wits, till Apollonius said, "You need not be afraid, for it is only a satyr that is running amuck here." "Yes, by Zeus," said Nilus, "it's the one that we naked sages have found insulting us for a long time past, and we could never stop his jumps and leaps." "But," said Apollonius, "I have a remedy against these hellhounds, which Midas is said once to have employed, for Midas himself had some of the blood of the satyrs in his veins, as was clear from the shape of his ears. And a satyr once, trespassing on his kinship with Midas, made merry at the expense of his ears, not only singing about them, but piping about them. Well, Midas, I understand, had heard from his mother that when satyr is overcome by wine, he falls asleep, and at such times comes to his senses, and will make friends with you. So he mixed wine which he had in his palace in a fountain, and let the satyr get at it, and the latter drank it up, and was overcome. And to show that the story is true, let us go to the headman of the village, and if the villagers have any wine, we will mix it with water, for the satyr and he will share the fate of Midas's satyr." They thought it a good plan, so he poured 4 Egyptian jars of wine into the trough out of which the village cattle drank, and then called the satyr by means of some secret rebuke or threat, and though as yet the latter was not visible, the wine sensibly diminished as if it was being drunk up. And when it was quite finished, Apollonius said, "Let us drink the satyr's health, for he is fast asleep." And with these words he led the villagers to the cave of the nymphs, which was not quite a furlong away from the village, and he showed them the satyr lying fast asleep in it. but told them not to hit him or abuse him. He said, "For his nonsense is stopped forever." Such was this exploit of Apollonius, and by heavens, we may call it not an incidental work in passing, but a masterwork of his passing by. And if you read the sage's epistle, in which he wrote to an insolent young man that he had sobered even a satyr demon in Ethiopia, you will perforce call to mind the above story. But we must not disbelieve that satyrs both exist and are susceptible to the passion of love. For I knew a youth of my own age in Lemnos, whose mother was said to be visited by a satyr, as he well might to judge by this story. For he was represented as wearing on his back a fawn skin that exactly fitted him, the front paws of which were drawn around his neck and fastened over his chest. But I must not go further into this subject, but anyhow, credit is due as much to experience of facts as it is to myself. Chapter 28. When he had come down from Ethiopia, the breach with Euphrates grew wider and wider, especially on account of daily disputes and discussions, though he left them to Menipus and Nilus to conduct, and seldom himself attacked Euphrates, being much too busy with the training of Nilus. Chapter 29. After Titus had taken Jerusalem, and when the country all round was filled with corpses, the neighboring races offered him a crown, but he disclaimed any such honor to himself, saying that it was not he himself that had accomplished this exploit, but that he had merely lent his arms to God, who had so manifested his wrath. And Apollonius praised his action, for therein he displayed a great deal of judgment and understanding of things human and divine, and it showed great moderation on his part that he refused to be crowned because he had shed blood. Accordingly, Apollonius indited to him a letter, which he sent by the hand of Damis, and of which the text was as follows: Apollonius sends greeting to Titus, the Roman general. Whereas you have refused to be proclaimed for success in war, and for shedding the blood of your enemies, I myself assign to you the crown of temperance and moderation, because you thoroughly understand what deeds really merit the crown. Farewell. Now Titus was overjoyed with this epistle, and replied, In my own behalf I thank you, no less than in behalf of my father, and I will not forget your kindness, for although I have captured Jerusalem, you have captured me. Chapter 30. And after Titus had been proclaimed autocrat in Rome, and rewarded with the meed of his valor, he went away to become the colleague in empire of his father. But he did not forget Apollonius, and thinking that even a short interview with him would be precious to himself, he besought him to come to Tarsus. And when he arrived, he embraced him, saying, My father has told me by letter everything in respect of which he consulted you, and lo, here is his letter, in which you are described as his benefactor, and the being to whom we owe all that we are. Now, though I am only just 30 years of age, I am held worthy of the same privileges to which my father only attained at the age of 60. I am called to the throne and to rule, perhaps before I have learnt myself to obey, and I therefore dread lest I am undertaking a task beyond my powers. Thereupon Apollonius, after stroking his neck, for he had as stout a neck as any athlete in training, said, And who will you force so sturdy a bull neck as yours under the yoke? He that from my youth up reared me as a calf, answered Titus, meaning his own father, and implying that he could only be controlled by the latter, who had accustomed him from childhood to obey himself. I am delighted, then, said Apollonius, in the first place, to see you prepared to subordinate yourself to your father, whom, without being his natural children, so many are delighted to obey, and next to see you rendering to his court an homage in which others will associate yourself. When youth and age are paired in authority, is there any lyre or any flute that will produce so sweet a harmony and so nicely blended? For the qualities of old age will be associated with those of youth, with the result that old age will gain in strength, and youth in discipline. End of Volume 2, Book 6, Chapters 21 through 30. Volume 2, Book 6, Chapters 31 through 43 of The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 6. Chapter 31. "And for myself, O man of Tyana," answered Titus, "can you give me any precepts as to how to rule and exercise the authority of a sovereign?" "Only such rules," replied the other, "as you have laid upon yourself, for in so submitting yourself to your father's will, it is, I think, certain that you will grow like him. And I would like to repeat to you on this occasion a saying of Archytas, which is a noble one and worth committing to memory. Archytas was a man of Tarentum, who was learned in the lore of Pythagoras, and he wrote a treatise on the education of children, in which he says, "Let the father be an example of virtue to his children, for fathers also will the more resolutely walk in the path of virtue, because their children are coming to resemble them." But for myself, I propose to associate with you my own companion Demetrius, who will attend you as much as you like, and instruct you in the whole duty of a good leader. "And what sort of wisdom, O Apollonius, does this person possess?" "Courage," he replied, "to speak the truth, unabashed by anyone, for he possesses the constancy and strength of character of a cynic." And as Titus did not seem very pleased to hear the name of a dog, he continued, "And yet in Homer, Telemachus, when he was young, required, it appears, 2 dogs, and the poet sends these to accompany the youth to the marketplace of Ithaca, in spite of their being irrational animals. But you will have a dog to accompany you, who will bark in your behalf, not only at other people, but at yourself in case you go wrong, and he will bark withal wisely and never irrationally." "Well," said the other, "give me your dog to accompany me, and I will even let him bite me, in case he feels I am committing injustice." "I will write to him a letter, for he teaches philosophy in Rome." "Pray do so," said Titus, "and I wish I could get someone to write to you in my behalf, and induce you to share with me my journey to Rome." "I will come there," said the other, "whenever it is best for both of us." Chapter 32. Then Titus dismissed the company, and said, "Now that we are alone, O man of Tyana, you will allow me, perhaps, to ask you a question upon matters of grave importance to myself." "Pray, do so," said the other, "and do so all the more readily, because the matter is so important." "It is about my own life," said the other, "and I would fain know whom I ought most to be on my guard against. That is my question, and I hope you will not think me cowardly for already being anxious about it." "Nay, you are only cautious," said the other, "and circumspect, for a man ought to be more careful about this than about anything else." And glancing at the sun, he swore by that God that he had himself intended to address Titus about this matter, even if he had not asked him. "For," he said, "the gods have told me to warn you, so long as your father is alive, to be on your guard against his bitterest enemies, but after his death against your own kith and kin." "And," said Titus. "In what way am I to die?" "In the same way," said the other, "as Odysseus is said to have died, for they say that he too met with his death by the sea." Damis interprets the above utterance as follows, namely, that he was to be on his guard against the cusp of the fish called the trigon, with which they say Odysseus was wounded. Anyhow, after he had occupied the throne for 2 years, in succession to his father, he died through eating the fish called the sea hare. And this fish, according to Damis, causes secret humours in the body worse and more fatal than anything else either in the sea or on land. And Nero, he says, introduced this sea hare in his dishes to poison his worst enemies. And so did Domitian, in order to remove his brother Titus, not because he objected to sharing his throne with his brother, but to sharing it with one who was both gentle and good. Such was their conversation in private, after which they embraced one another in public. And as Titus departed, Apollonius greeted him with these last words: "Pray you, my king, overcome your enemies by your arms, but your father by your virtues." Chapter 33. But the letter to Demetrius ran as follows: Apollonius, the philosopher, sends greetings to Demetrius, the cynic. I have made a present of you to the Emperor Titus, that you may instruct him how to behave as a sovereign, and take care that you confirm the truth of my words to him, and make yourself, anger apart, everything to him. Farewell. Chapter 34. Now the inhabitants of Tarsus had previously detested Apollonius, because of the violent reproaches which he addressed to them, owing to the fact that through their languid indifference and sensual indolence they could not put up with the vigour of his remarks. But on this occasion they became such devoted admirers of our hero as to regard him as their second founder and the mainstay of their city. For on one occasion the emperor was offering a sacrifice in public, when the whole body of citizens met and presented a petition to him, asking for certain great favours. And he replied that he would mention the matter to his father, and be himself their ambassador to procure them what they wanted. Whereupon Apollonius stepped forward and said, "Supposing I convicted some who are standing here of being your own and your father's enemies, and of having sent legates to Jerusalem to excite a rebellion, and of being secret allies of your most open enemies, what would happen to them?" "Why, what else," said the emperor, "than instant death?" "Then is it not disgraceful," replied Apollonius, "that you should be instant in demanding their punishment, and yet dilatory in conferring a boon, and be ready yourself to undertake the punishment, but reserve the benefaction until you can see and consult your father?" But the king, over-delighted with this remark, said, "I grant the favours they ask for my father will not be annoyed at my yielding to truth and to yourself." Chapter 35. So many were the races which they say Apollonius had visited until then, eager and zealous for others as they for him. But his subsequent journeys abroad, though they were numerous, were yet not so many as before, nor did he go to fresh districts which he was not already acquainted with. For when he came down from Ethiopia, he made a long stay on the seaboard of Egypt, and then he returned to Phoenicia and Cilicia, and to Ionia and Isatsa and Italy, never failing anywhere to show himself the same as ever. For, hard as it is to know oneself, I myself consider it still harder for the sage to remain always himself, for he cannot ever reform evil natures and improve them, unless he has first trained himself never to alter in his own person. Now about these matters I have discoursed at length in other treatises, and shown those of my readers who were careful and hard students, that a man who is really a man will never alter his nature, nor become a slave. But lest I should unduly prolong this work, by giving a minute account of the several teachings which he addressed to individuals, and lest, on the other hand, I should skip over any important chapter of a life, which I am taking so much pains to transmit to those who never knew Apollonius, I think it time to record more important incidents and matters which will repay the remembering, for we must consider that such episodes are comparable to the visits to mankind paid by the sons of Asclepius. Chapter 36. There was a youth who, without having any education of his own, undertook to educate birds, which he kept in his home, to make them clever. And he taught them to talk like human beings, and to whistle tunes like flute players. Apollonius met him and asked, "How are you occupying yourself?" And when he replied, and told him all about his nightingales and his blackbirds, and how he trained the tongues of stone curlews, as he had himself a very uneducated accent, Apollonius said, "I think you are spoiling the accents of the birds, in the first place because you don't let them utter their own notes, which are so sweet that not even the best musical instruments could rival or imitate them, and in the second place because you yourself talk the vilest Greek dialects, and are only teaching them to stutter like yourself. And what is more, my good youth, you are also wasting your own substance. For when I look at all your hangers-on, and at your get-up, I should say that you are a delicately bred and somewhat wealthy man. But sycophants squeeze people like yourself, at the same time that they shoot out their tongues at them like so many goads. And what will be the use to you of all this bird-fancying, when the time comes? For if you collected all the songbirds in the world, it would not help you to shake off these parasites that cling to you and oppress you. Nay, you are forced to shower your wealth upon them, and cast your gold before them, as you scatter titbits before dogs, and to stop their barking you must give again and again, until at last you will find yourself reduced to hunger and to poverty. What you want is some splendid diversion, which will instantly make some alteration in your character. Otherwise, you will wake up one day and find that you have been plucked of your wealth as if it were plumage, and that you are a fitter subject to excite the birds to lament than to sing. The remedy you need to effect such a change is not a very great one, for there is in all these cities a class of men whose acquaintance you have never made, but who are called schoolmasters. You give them a little of your substance, with the certainty of getting it back with interest, for they will teach you the rhetoric of the forum, and it is not a difficult art to acquire. I may add that, if I had known you as a child, and come across you then, I should have advised you assiduously to attend at the doors of the philosophers and sophists, so as to be able to hedge round your habitation with a wider learning. But, since it is too late for you to manage that, at any rate, learn to plead for yourself. For remember, if you had acquired a more complete training and education, you would have resembled a man who is heavy-armed and therefore formidable. Yet, if you thoroughly learn this branch, you will at any rate be equipped like a light-armed soldier or a slinger, for you will be able to fling words at your sycophants as you would stones at dogs. The young man took to heart this advice, and he gave up wasting his time over birds, and betook himself to school, much to the improvement both of his judgment and of his tongue. Chapter 37. Two stories are told in Sardis. One, that the river Pactolus used to bring down gold dust to Croesus, and the other, that trees are older than earth. The former story Apollonius said he accepted because it was probable, for that there had once been a sand of gold on Mount Molus, and that the showers of rain had swept it down into the river Pactolus, although subsequently, as is generally the case in such matters, it had given out, being all washed away. But the second story he ridiculed, and said, "You pretend that trees were created before earth? Well, I have been studying philosophy all this time, yet have never heard of the stars being created before the heaven." The inference he wished to convey was that nothing could be created as long as that in which it grows does not exist. Chapter 38. The ruler of Syria had plunged Antioch into a feud by disseminating among the citizens suspicions such that when they met in assembly they all quarreled with one another. But a violent earthquake happened to occur. They were all cowering, and, as is usual in the case of heavenly portents, praying for one another. Apollonius accordingly stepped forward and remarked, "It is God who is clearly anxious to reconcile you to one another, and you will not revive the feuds since you cherish the same fears." And so he implanted in them a sense of what was to happen to them, and made each faction entertain the same fears as the other. Chapter 39. Here is another incident worth recording. A certain man was sacrificing to Mother Earth in hope of finding a treasure, and he did not hesitate to offer a prayer to Apollonius with that intent. He, perceiving what he was after, said, "I see that you are terribly fond of filthy lucre." "Nay, I am a poor devil," remarked the other, "that have nothing except a few pence, and not enough to feed my family." "You seem," said the other, "to keep a large household of idle servants, nor do you yourself appear to be wanting in wits." But the man shed a quiet tear, and answered, "I have 4 daughters who want 4 dowries, and, when my daughters have had their dowries assigned to them, my capital, which is now only 20,000 drachmas, will have vanished, and they will think that I have got all too little, while I shall perish because I shall have nothing at all." Therefore Apollonius took compassion on him, and said, "We will provide for you, myself and Mother Earth, for I hear that you are sacrificing to her." With these words he conducted the man into the suburbs, as if he were going to buy some fruit. But there he saw an estate planted with olive trees, and being delighted with the trees, for they were very good ones and well grown, and there was also a little garden in the place, in which he saw beehives and flowers, he went on into the garden, as if he had some important business to examine into, and then, having put up a prayer to Pandora, he returned to the city. Then he proceeded to the owner of the field, who had amassed a fortune in the most unrighteous manner, by informing against the estates of Phoenicians, and said, "For how much did you purchase such and such an estate? And how much labor have you spent upon it?" The other replied that he had bought the estate a year before for the sum of 15,000 drachmas, but that as yet he had spent no labor upon it. Whereupon Apollonius persuaded him to sell it to him for 20,000 drachmas, which he did, esteeming the 5,000 to be a great windfall. Now, the man who wanted to find the treasure did not in the least understand the gift that was made him. Indeed, he hardly considered it a fair bargain for himself, and all the worse a bargain, because, whereas he might have kept the 20,000 drachmas that he had in hand, he now reflected that the estate which he purchased for the sum might suffer from frost and hailstorms, and from other influences ruinous to the crops. But when he found a jar almost at once in the field containing 3,000 darics, close by the beehive in the little garden, And when he got a very large yield from the olive trees, when everywhere else the crops had failed, he began to hymn the praises of the sage, and his house was crowded with suitors for the hands of his daughters, urging their suits upon him. Chapter 40. Here is another story which I came upon about Apollonius, and which deserves to be put upon record. There was a man who was in love with a nude statue of Aphrodite, which is erected in the island of Cnidus, and he was making offerings to it, and said that he would make yet others with a view to marrying the statue. But Apollonius, though on other grounds he thought his conduct absurd, yet as the islanders were not adverse to the idea, but said that the fame of the goddess would be greatly enhanced if she had a lover, determined to purge the temple of all this nonsense. And when the Cnidians asked him if he would reform their system of sacrifice or their litanies in any way, he replied, "I will reform your eyes, but let the ancestral service of your temple continue as it is." Accordingly, he called to him the languished lover, and asked him if he believed in the existence of gods. And when he replied that he believed in their existence so firmly that he was actually in love with them, and mentioned a marriage with one of them which he hoped to celebrate shortly, Apollonius replied, "The poets have turned your poor head by their talk of unions with Anchises and Peleus, and other heroes with goddesses. But I know this much about loving and being loved. Gods fall in love with gods, and human beings with human beings, and animals with animals, and in a word, like with like, and they have true issue of their own kind. But when two beings of different kinds contract a union, there is no true marriage or love. And if you only would bear in mind the fate of Ixion, you would never have dreamed of falling in love with beings so much above you. For he, you remember, is bent and stretched across the heavens like a wheel, and you, unless you get out of this shrine, will perish wherever you are upon earth, nor will you be able to say that the gods have been unjust in their sentence upon you." Thus he put a stop to this mad freak, and the man went away who said he was in love, after sacrificing in order to gain forgiveness. Chapter 41. At one time, the cities on the left side of the Hellespont were visited by earthquakes, and Egyptians and Chaldeans went begging about through them to collect money, pretending that they wanted 10 talents with which to offer sacrifices to Earth and to Poseidon. And the cities began to contribute under the stress of fear, partly out of their common funds, and partly out of private. But the impostors refused to offer the sacrifices in behalf of their dupes, unless the money was deposited in the banks. Now the sage determined not to allow the people of the Hellespont to be imposed upon, so he visited their cities, and drove out the quacks who were making money out of the misfortunes of others. And then he divined the causes of the supernatural wrath, and by making such offerings as suited each case, averted the visitation at small cost, and the land was at rest. Chapter 42. The Emperor Domitian, about the same time, passed a law against making men eunuchs, and against planting fresh vineyards, and also in favor of cutting down vineyards already planted. Whereon Apollonius, who was visiting the Ionians, remarked, "These rescripts do not concern me, for I, alone perhaps of mankind, require neither to beget my kind nor to drink wine, but our egregious sovereign seems not aware that he is sparing mankind while he eunuchizes the earth." This witticism emboldened the Ionians to send a deputation to the emperor in behalf of their vines, and ask for a repeal of the law which ordered the earth to be laid waste and not planted. Chapter 43. Here too is a story which they tell of him in Tarsus. A mad dog had attacked a lad, and as a result of the bite, the lad behaved exactly like a dog, for he barked and howled, and went on all 4 feet, using his hands as such, and ran about in that manner. And he had been ill in this way for 30 days, when Apollonius, who had recently come to Tarsus, met him, and ordered him to look for the dog which had done the harm. But they said that the dog had not been found, because the youth had been attacked outside the wall when he was practicing with javelins. Nor could they learn from the patient what the dog was like, for he did not even know himself any more. Then Apollonius reflected for a moment, and said, "O Damis, the dog is a white, shaggy sheepdog, as big as an Amphilochian hound, and he is standing at a certain fountain trembling all over, for he is longing to drink the water, but at the same time is afraid of it. Bring him to me to the bank of the river, where there are the wrestling grounds, merely telling him that it is I who call him." So Damis dragged the dog along, and it crouched at the feet of Apollonius, crying out as a suppliant might do before an altar. But he quite tamed it by stroking it with his hand, and then he stood by the lad close by, holding him with his hand, and in order that the multitude might be cognizant of so great a mystery, he said, "The soul of Telephus of Mysia has been transferred into this boy, and the fates impose the same things upon him as upon Telephus." And with these words he bade the dog lick the wound all round where he had bitten the boy, so that the agent of the wound might in turn be its physician and healer. After that, the boy returned to his father, and recognized his mother, and saluted his comrades as before, and drank of the waters of the Cydnus. Nor did the sage neglect the dog either, but after offering a prayer to the river, he sent the dog across it, and when the dog had crossed the river, he took his stand on the opposite bank, and began to bark, a thing which mad dogs rarely do, and he folded back his ears and wagged his tail, because he knew that he was all right again, for a draught of water cures a mad dog, if he has only the courage to take it. Such were the exploits of our sage in behalf of both temples and cities. Such were the discourses he delivered to the public or in behalf of different communities, and in behalf of those who were dead or who were sick. And such were the harangues he delivered to wise and unwise alike, and to the sovereigns who consulted him about moral virtue. End of Volume 2, Book 6, Chapters 31 through 43. Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 1 through 7 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus. Translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 7. Chapter 1. I am aware that the conduct of philosophers under despotism is the truest touchstone of their character, and am in favor of inquiring in what way one man displays more courage than another. And my argument also urges me to consider the point, for during the reign of Domitian, Apollonius was beset by accusations and writs of information, the several origins, sources, and counts of which I shall presently enlarge upon. And as I shall be under the necessity of specifying the language which he used, and the role which he assumed when he left the court after convicting the tyrant rather than being himself convicted, so I must first of all enumerate all the feats of wise men in the presence of tyrants which I have found worthy of commemoration, and contrast them with the conduct of Apollonius. For this, I think, is the best way of finding out the truth. Chapter 2. Zeno, then of Elea, who was the father of dialectic, was convicted of an attempt to overthrow the tyranny of Nearchus the Mysian, and being put to the rack, he refused to divulge the names of his accomplices, though he accused of disloyalty those who were loyal to the tyrant, with the result that, whereas they were put to death on the assumption that his accusations were true, he effected the liberation of the Mysians by tripping despotism up over itself. And Plato also declares that he took up the cause of the liberation of the people of Sicily, and associated himself in this enterprise with Dion. And Phaeton, when he was banished from Rhegium, fled to Dionysius, the tyrant of Sicily. But being treated with more honor than an exile might expect, he realized that the tyrant had designs also upon Rhegium, and he informed the people there of this by letter. But he was caught doing so by the tyrant, who forthwith fastened him to one of his siege engines alive, and then pushed it forward against the walls, imagining that the inhabitants of Rhegium would not shoot at the machine in order to spare Phaeton. He, however, cried out to them to shoot, for, said he, "I am the target of your liberty." And Heraclides and Phaeton, who slew Cotis the Thracian, were both of them young men, and they embraced the discipline and life of the academy, and made themselves wise, and so free men. And who does not know the story of Callisthenes of Olynthus? He, on one and the same day, delivered himself of a panegyric and of an attack upon the Macedonians, just at the time when they were at the acme of their power, and they put him to death for exciting their displeasure. Then there were Diogenes of Sinope, and Crates of Thebes, of whom the former went direct to Chaeronea, and rebuked Philip for his treatment of the Athenians, on the grounds that, though asserting himself to be a descendant of Hercules, he yet was destroying by force of arms those who had taken up arms in defense of the descendants of Hercules. The other, Crates, when Alexander had declared that he would rebuild Thebes for his sake, replied that he would never stand in need of a country or of a city which anyone could raze to the ground by mere force of arms. Many more examples of this kind could be adduced, but my treatise does not allow me to prolong them. It is indeed incumbent upon me to criticize these examples, not in order to show that they were not as remarkable as they are universally famous, but only to show that they fall short of the exploits of Apollonius, in spite of their being the best of their kind. Chapter 3. About the conduct of Zeno of Aelia, then, and about the murder of Coites, there is nothing very remarkable. For it is easy to enslave Thriaeans and Getae, so it is an act of folly to liberate them. For indeed they do not appreciate freedom, because, I imagine, they do not esteem slavery to be base. I will not say that Plato somewhat lacked wisdom when he set himself to reform the affairs of Sicily rather than those of Athens, or that he was sold in all fairness when, after deceiving others, he found himself deceived, for I fear to offend my readers. But the despotic sway of Dionysius over Sicily was already tottering when Phaeton of Rhegium made his attempt against him, and in any case he would have been put to death by him, even if the people of that city had not shot their bolts at him. His achievement, then, I think, was by no means wonderful. He only preferred to die in behalf of the liberty of others, rather than endure the death penalty by being himself a slave. And as for Callisthenes, even today he cannot acquit himself of baseness, for in first commending and then attacking one and the same set of people, he either attacked those whom he felt to be worthy of praise, or he praised those whom he ought to have been openly attacking. Moreover, a person who sets himself to abuse good men cannot escape the charge of being envious, while he who flatters the wicked by his very praises of them draws down upon his own head the guilt of their misdeeds, for evil men are only rendered more evil when you praise them. And Diogenes, if he had addressed Philip in the way he did before the battle of Chaeronea, instead of after it, might have preserved him from the guilt of taking up arms against Athens. But instead of doing so, he waited till the harm was done, when he could only reproach him, but not reform him. As for Crates, he must needs incur the censure of every patriot for not seconding Alexander in his design of recolonizing Thebes. But Apollonius had not to fear for any country that was endangered, nor was he in despair of his own life, nor was he reduced to silly and idle speeches, nor was he championing the cause of Mysians or Getae, nor was he face to face with one who was only sovereign in a single island or of an inconsiderable country, for he confronted one who was master both of sea and land, at a time when his tyranny was harsh and bitter, and he took his stand against the tyrant in behalf of the welfare of his subjects, with the same spirit and purpose as he had taken his stand against Nero. Chapter 4. Some may think that his attitude towards Nero was a mere bit of skirmishing, because he did not come to close quarters with him, but merely undermined his despotism by his encouragement of Vindex, and the terror with which he inspired Tigellinus. And there are certain braggarts here who foster the tale that it required no great courage to assail a man like Nero, who led the life of a female harpist or flautist. But what, I would ask, have they to say about Domitian? For he was vigorous in body, and he abjured all those pleasures of music and song which wear away and soften down ferocity. And he took pleasure in the sufferings of others, and in any lamentations they uttered. And he was in the habit of saying that distrust is the best safeguard of the people against their tyrants, and of the tyrant against the multitude. And though he thought that a sovereign ought to rest from all hard work during the night, yet he deemed it the right season to begin murdering people in. And the result was that the Senate had all its most distinguished members cut off, philosophy was reduced to cowering in a corner, to such an extent that some of its votaries disguised themselves by changing their dress, and ran away to take refuge among the western Celts, while others fled to the deserts of Libya or Scythia, and others again stooped to compose orations in which his crimes were palliated. But Apollonius, like Tiresias, who is represented by Sophocles as addressing to Oedipus the words, "For 'tis not in your slavery that I live, but in that of Loxias," chose wisdom as his mistress, and escaped scot-free from paying tribute to Domitian. Applying to himself, as if it were an oracle, the verse of Tiresias and of Sophocles, and fearing nothing for himself, but only pitying the fate of others, he set himself to rally round him all the younger men of the Senate, and husband such intelligence as he saw discerned in many of them. And he visited the provinces, and in the name of philosophy he appealed to the governors, pointing out to them that the strength of tyrants is not immortal, and that the very fact of their being dreaded exposes them to defeat. And he also reminded them of the Panathenaic festival in Attica, at which hymns are sung in honor of Harmodius and Aristogiton, and of the sally that was made from Phyle, when 30 tyrants at once were overthrown. And he also reminded them of the ancient history of the Romans, and of how they too had originally been a democracy, after driving out despotism, arms in hand. Chapter 5. And on an occasion when a tragic actor visited Ephesus, and came forward in the play called the Aino, and when the governor of Asia was one of the audience, a man who, though still young, and of distinguished rank among the consuls, was nevertheless very nervous about such matters, just as the actor finished the speech, in which Euripides describes in his iambes how tyrants, after long growth of their power, are destroyed by little causes, Apollonius leapt up and said, but yonder coward understands neither Euripides nor myself. Chapter 6. When, moreover, the news was brought how notable a purification of the goddess Vesta of the Romans Domitian had carried out, by putting to death 3 of the Vestal virgins who had broken their vows and incurred the pollution of marriage, when it was their duty to minister in purity to the Athene of Ilium and to the fire which was worshipped in Rome, he exclaimed, O son, would that thou couldst be purified of the unjust murders with which the whole world is just now filled. Nor did he do all this in private, as a coward might, but proclaimed his sentiments and aspirations amidst the crowd and before all. Chapter 7. On another occasion, when after the murder of Sabinus, one of his own relations, Domitian was about to marry Julia, who was herself the wife of the murdered man, and Domitian's own niece being one of the daughters of Titus, Ephesus was about to celebrate the marriage with sacrifice. Only Apollonius interrupted the rites by exclaiming, O thou knight of the Danaids of yore, how unique thou wast! End of Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 1 through 7. Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 8 through 12 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 7. Chapter 8. The following, then, is the history of his acts in Rome. Nerva was regarded as a proper candidate for the throne which, after Domitian's death, he occupied with so much wisdom, and the same opinion was entertained of Orphetus and of Rufus. Domitian accused the 2 latter of intriguing against himself, and they were confined in islands, while Nerva was commanded to live in Tarentum. Now Apollonius had been intimate with them all the time that Titus shared the throne with his father, and also reigned after his father's death, and he was in constant correspondence with them on the subject of self-control, being anxious to enlist them on the side of the sovereigns whose excellence of character he esteemed. But he did his best to alienate them from Domitian, on account of his cruelty, and encouraged them to espouse the cause of the freedom of all. Now it occurred to him that his epistles conveying advice to them were fraught with danger to them, for many of those who were in power were betrayed by their own slaves and friends and womenkind, and there was not at the time any house that could keep a secret. Accordingly, he would take now one and now another of the discreetest of his own companions, and say to them, I have a brilliant secret to entrust to you, for you must betake yourself as my agent to Rome to so-and-so, mentioning the party, and you must hold converse with him, and do the utmost I could do to win him over. But when he heard that they were banished for having displayed a tendency to revolt against the tyrant, and yet had from timidity abandoned their plans, he delivered a discourse on the subject of the fates and of destiny in the grove of Smyrna, in which stands the statue of the river Meles. Chapter 9. And being aware that Nerva would before long become sovereign, he went on to explain in his oration that not even tyrants are able to force the hand of destiny, and directing the attention of his audience to the brazen statue of Domitian, which had been erected close to that of Meles, he said, Thou fool, how much art thou mistaken in thy views of destiny and fate! For even if thou shouldst slay the man who is fated to be despot after thyself, he shall come to life again. This saying was reported to Domitian by the malevolence of Euphrates, and though no one knew to which of his personages above mentioned this oracle applied, yet the despot, in order to allay his fears, determined to put them to death. But in order that he might seem to have an excuse for doing so, he summoned Apollonius before him to defend himself on the charge of holding secret relations against them. For he considered that, if he came, he could get a sentence pronounced against him, and so avoid the imputation of having put people to death without trial, seeing that they would have been convicted through Apollonius. Or, in the alternative case, if the latter, by some ruse, avoided an open trial, then the fate of the others would all the more certainly be sealed, because sentence would have been passed on them by their own accomplice. Chapter 10. Moved by these considerations, Domitian had already written to the governor of Asia, directing the man of Tyana to be arrested and brought to Rome, when the latter, foreseeing in his usual way through a divine instinct what was coming, told his companions that they needed to depart on a mysterious voyage. And they were reminded of the opinion enunciated by Abaris of old, and felt that he was intent upon some such scheme. Apollonius, however, without revealing his intention even to Damis, set sail in his company for Achaia, and having landed at Corinth, and worshipped the sun about midday, with his usual rites, embarked in the evening for Sicily and Italy. And falling in with a favourable wind and a good current that ran in his direction, he reached Dicaercia on the 5th day. There he met Demetrius, who passed for being the boldest of the philosophers, simply because he did not live far away from Rome, and knowing that he was really to get out of the way of the tyrant, he said by way of amusing himself, "I have caught you in your luxury, dwelling here in the most blessed part of happy Italy, if indeed she be happy, here where Odysseus is said to have forgotten, in the company of Calypso, the smoke of his Ithacan home." Thereupon Demetrius embraced him, and after sundry pious ejaculations, said, "O ye gods! What will come upon philosophy if she risks the loss of such a man as yourself?" He asked, "And what risks does she run?" Said the other, "Those, surely, a foreknowledge of which brought you here. For if I do not know what is in your mind, then I do not know what is in my own. But let us not conduct our conversation here, but let us retire to where we can talk together alone, and let only Damis be present, whom, by Hercules, I am inclined to consider an Iolaus of your labours." Chapter 11. With these words, Demetrius led them to the villa in which Cicero lived of old, and it is close by the city. There they sat down under a plane tree where the grasshoppers were chirping to the soft music of the summer's breeze, when Demetrius, glancing up at them, remarked, "O ye blessed insects, and unfeignedly wise! It would seem then that the Muses have taught you a song which is neither actionable, nor likely to be informed against, and they made you superior to all wants of the belly, and settled you far above all human envy to live in these trees, on which you sit and sing in your blessedness about your own and the Muses' prerogative of happiness." Now Apollonius understood the drift of this apostrophe, but it jarred upon him as inconsistent with the strenuous professions of his friend. He said, "It seems, then, that though you only wanted to sing the praises of the grasshoppers, you could not do it openly, but come cowering hither, as if there were a public law against anyone praising the grasshoppers." He replied, "I said what I did, not by way of praising them, but of signifying that, while they are left unmolested in their concert halls, we are not allowed even to mutter, for wisdom has been rendered a penal offense. And whereas the indictment of Anytus and Miletus ran, Socrates commits wrong in corrupting youth and introducing a new religion, we are indicted in such terms as these: so-and-so commits wrong by being wise and just and gifted with understanding of the gods no less than of men, and with a wide knowledge of the laws. And as for yourself, so far forth as you are cleverer and wiser than the rest of us, so much the more cleverly is the indictment against you drawn up. For Domitian intends to implicate you in the charges for which Nerva and his associates are banished." Apollonius said, "But for what crime are they banished?" "For what is reckoned by the persecutor to be the greatest of latter-day crimes. He says that he has caught these persons in the act of trying to usurp his throne, and accuses you of instigating their attempt by mutilating, I think, a boy. What, as if it were by an eunuch, that I want his empire overthrown? He replied, It is not that of which we are falsely accused, but they declare that you sacrificed a boy to divine the secrets of futurity, which are to be learned from an inspection of youthful entrails. And in the indictment, your dress and manner of life are also impugned, and the fact of your being an object of worship to some. This, then, is what I have heard from our Telesinos, no less your intimate than mine. Exclaimed Apollonius, What luck if we could meet Telesinos, for I suppose you mean the philosopher who held consular rank in the reign of Nero. He said, The same, but how are you to come across him? For despots are doubly suspicious of any man of rank should they find him holding communication with men who lie under such an accusation as you do. And Telesinos, moreover, gave way quietly before the edict which has lately been issued against philosophers of every kind, because he preferred to be an exile as a philosopher to remaining in Rome as a consul. Apollonius said, I would not have him run any risks on my account, anyhow, for the risks he runs in behalf of philosophy are serious enough. Chapter 12. But tell me this, Demetrius, what do you think I had better say or do in order to allay my own fears? Said the other, You had better not trifle, nor pretend to be afraid of what you do not dread. For if you really thought these accusations dangerous, you would have been away by now, and evaded the necessity of defending yourself from them. Apollonius said, And would you run away if you were placed in the same danger as myself? He replied, I would not, I swear by Athene, if there were someone to judge me. But in fact there is no fair trial, and if I did offer a defense, no one would even listen to me. Or if I were listened to, I should be slain all the more certainly because I was known to be innocent. You would not, I suppose, care to see me choose so cold-blooded and slavish a death as that, rather than one which befits a philosopher. And I imagine it behooves a philosopher to die in the attempt either to liberate his city or to protect his parents and children and brothers and other kinsfolk, or to die struggling for his friends, who in the eyes of the wise are more precious than mere kinsfolk, or for favorites that have been purchased by love. But to be put to death, not for true reasons, but for fancy ones, and to furnish the tyrant with a pretext for being considered wise, is much worse and more grievous than to be bowed and bent high in the sky on a wheel, as they say Ixion was. But it seems to me the very fact of your coming here will be the beginning of your trial. For though you may attribute your journey hither to your quiet conscience, and to the fact that you would have never ventured upon it if you were guilty, Domitian will credit you with nothing of the kind, but will merely believe that you ventured on so hardy a course because you possess some mysterious power. For think, 10 days, they say, have not elapsed since you were cited to appear, and you turn up at the court without even having heard as yet that you were to undergo a trial. Will not that be tantamount to justifying the accusation? For everyone will think that you foreknew the event, and the story about the boy will gain credit therefrom. And take care that the discourse which they say you delivered about the fates and necessity in Ionia does not come true of yourself, and that, in case destiny has some cruelty in store, you are not marching straight to meet it with your hands tied, just because you won't see that discretion is the better part of valor. And if you have not forgotten the affairs of Nero's reign, you will remember my own case, and that I showed no coward's dread of death. But then one gained some respite. For although Nero's harp was ill attuned to the dignity that befits a king, and clashed therewith, yet, in other ways, its music harmonized his mood not unpleasantly with ours. For he was often induced thereby to grant a truce to his victims, and stay his murderous hand. At any rate, He did not slay me, although I attracted his sword to myself as much by your discourses as by my own, which were delivered against the bath, and the reason why he did not slay me was that just then his voice improved, and he achieved, as he thought, a very brilliant melody. But where's the royal nightingale, and where the harp to which we can today make our peace offerings? For the outlook of today is unredeemed by music, and full of spleen, and this tyrant is as little likely to be charmed by himself as by other people. It is true that Pindar says, in praise of the lyre, that it charms the savage breast of Ares, and stays his hand from war. But this ruler, although he has established a musical contest in Rome, and offers a public crown for those who win therein, nevertheless slew several of the people who, so I hear, piped and sang in his last musical contest. And you should also consider our friends and their safety, for you will certainly ruin them as well as yourself, if you make a show of being brave, or use arguments which will not be listened to. But your life lies within your reach, for here are ships, you see how many there are, some about to sail for Libya, others for Egypt, others for Phoenicia and Cyprus, others direct to Sardinia, others still for places beyond Sardinia. It were be best for you to embark on one of these, and betake yourself to one or another of these provinces. For the hand of tyranny is less heavy upon distinguished men, if it perceives that they only desire to live quietly, and not put themselves forward. End of Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 8-12. Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 13-19 of The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 7. Damis was so impressed by the arguments of Demetrius that he exclaimed, "Well, you, anyhow, are a friend, and by your presence you can do a very great service to my master here. As for me, I am of little account, and if I advised him not to throw somersaults upon naked swords, nor expose himself to risks with tyrants, than whom none were ever yet deemed harsher, he would not listen to me. As a matter of fact, I should never have known, if I had not met you, what he meant by his journey hither, for I follow him more readily, more blindly, than another man would follow himself. And if you asked me where I am bound, or for what, I should merely excite your laughter by telling you that I was traversing the seas of Sicily and the bays of Etruria, without knowing in the least why I took ship. And if only I were courting these dangers after I had received open warning, I could then say to those who asked me the question, that Apollonius was courting death, and that I was accompanying him on board ship because I was his rival in his passion. But as I know nothing of this matter, it's time for me to speak of what I do know, and I will say it in the interests of my master. For if I were put to death, I would not do much harm to philosophy, for I am like the esquire of some distinguished soldier, and am only entitled to consideration because I am of his suit. But if someone is going to be set on to slay him, and tyrants find it easy to contrive plots and to remove obstacles from their path, then I think a regular trophy will have been raised over the defeat of philosophy in the person of the noblest of her human representatives. And as there are many people lurking in our path, such as were Anytus and Meletus, writs of information will be scattered from all quarters at once against the companions of Apollonius. One will be accused of having laughed when his master attacked tyranny, another of having encouraged him to talk, a third of having suggested to him a topic to talk about, a fourth of having left his lecture room with praise on his lips for what he had heard. I admit that one ought to die in the cause of philosophy in the sense of dying for one's temples, one's own walls, and one's sepulchres. For there are many famous heroes who have embraced death in order to save and protect such interests as those. But I pray that neither I myself may die in order to bring about the ruin of philosophy, and that no one else either may die for such an object who loves philosophy and loves Apollonius. Chapter 14. Apollonius answered thus: We must make allowance for the very timid remarks which Damis has made about the situation, for he is a Syrian and lives on the borders of Media, where tyrants are worshipped, and where no one entertains a lofty ideal of freedom. But as for yourself, I do not see how you can defend yourself at the bar of philosophy from the charge of trumping up fears, from which, even if there were really any reason for them, you ought to try to wean him. Instead of doing so, you try to plunge into terror a man who is only too inclined to tremble at imaginary dangers. I would indeed have a wise man sacrifice his life for the objects you have mentioned, but any man without being wise would equally die for them. For it is an obligation of law that we should die in behalf of our freedom, and an injunction of nature that we should die in behalf of our kinsfolk, or of our friends or darlings. Now all men are the slaves of nature and of law, the willing slaves of nature, as the unwilling ones of law. But it is the duty of the wise, in a still higher degree, to lay down their lives for tenets they have embraced. Here are interests which neither law has laid upon us, nor nature planted in us from birth, but to which we have devoted ourselves out of mere strength of character and courage. In behalf, therefore, of these, should anyone try to violate them, let the wise man pass through the fire, let him bare his neck to the axe, for he will not be overcome by any such threats, nor driven to any sort of subterfuge, but he will cleave to all he knows as firmly as if it were a religion in which he had been initiated. As for myself, I am acquainted with more than other human beings, for I know all things, and what I know partly for good men, partly for wise ones, partly for myself, partly for the gods, but for tyrants nothing. But that I am not come on any fool's errand, you can see if you will, for I run no risk of my life myself, nor shall I die at the hands of a despot, however much I might wish to do so. But I am aware that I am running a risk in connection with persons of whom the tyrant may accuse me of being either the leader or the accomplice. Let me be whatever he likes, I am content. But if I were to betray them by holding back, or by cowardly refusal to face the accusation, what would good men think of me? Who would not justly slay me for playing with the lives of men to whom was entrusted everything I had besought of heaven? And I would like to point out to you that I could not possibly escape the reputation of being a traitor. For there are two kinds of tyrants. The one kind put their victims to death without trial, the other after they had been brought before a court of law. The former kind resemble the more passionate and prompt of wild beasts. The other kind resemble the gentler and more lethargic ones. That both kinds are cruel is clear to everybody who takes Nero as an example of the impetuous despotism which does not trouble about legal forms. Tiberius, on the other hand, of the tardy and sluggish nature. For the former destroyed his victims before they had any suspicion of what was coming, and the other after he had tortured them with long drawn-out terror. For myself, I consider those the crueler who make a pretense of legal trial, and of getting a verdict pronounced in accordance with the law, for in reality they set them at defiance, and bring in the same verdict as they would have done without any real trial, giving the name of law to that which merely ekes out of their own spleen. The very fact of their being put to death in legal form does but deprive the wretches so condemned to death of that compassion on the part of the crowd, which should be tendered like a winding sheet to the victims of injustice. Well, I perceive that the present ruler cloaks his tyranny under legal forms. But it seems to me that he ends by condemning without trial, for he really sentences men before they enter the court, and then brings them before it as if they had not yet been tried. Now one who was formerly condemned by a verdict in court can obviously say he perished owing to an illegal sentence, but how can he that evades his trial escape condemnation by his own conscience? And supposing now that the fate of such distinguished persons also rests on me, I do manage to run away from the crisis which equally impends over them and myself. What can save me no matter where I go on all the earth from the brand of infamy? For let us suppose that you have delivered yourself of all these sentiments, and that I have admitted their correctness and acted on them, and that, in consequence, our friends have been murdered. What prayers could I offer in such a case for a favorable voyage? What haven could I cast anchor in? To whom could I set out on any voyage? For methinks I should have to steer clear of any land over which the Romans rule, and should have to seek men who are my friends, and yet do not live in sight of the tyrant, and that would be Phraotes, and the Babylonian, and the divine Iarchus, and the noble Thespesian. Now supposing I set out for Ethiopia, what, my excellent friend, could I tell Thespesian? For if I concealed this episode, I should prove myself a lover of falsehood, nay, worse, a slave, while if I frankly confessed all to him, I could only use such words as these: O Thespesian, Euphrates slandered me to you, and accused me of things that are not on my conscience. For he said that I was a boaster and a miracle-monger, and one that violated wisdom, especially that of the Indians. But while I am none of these things, I am nevertheless a betrayer of my own friends, and their murderer, and utterly unreliable, and so forth. And if there is any wreath for virtue, I come to wear it, because I have ruined the greatest of the Roman houses so utterly, that henceforth they are left desolate. You blush, Demetrius, to hear such words. I see that you do so. What then, if you turn from Thespesian to Phraotes, and imagine me fleeing to India to take refuge with such a man as he? How should I look him in the face? How should I explain the motive of my flight? Should I not have to say that when I visited him before, I was a gentleman not too faint-hearted to lay down my life for my friends, but that after enjoying his society, I had, at your bidding, thrown away with scorn this divinest of human privileges? And as for Iarchus, he surely would not ask me any question at all when I arrived. But just as Aeolus once bade Odysseus quit his island with ignominy, because he had made a bad use of the gift of a good wind which he had bestowed on him, so Iarchus, I imagine, would drive me from his eminence, and tell me that I had disgraced the draught I there had from the cup of Tantalus. For they require a man who stoops and drinks of that goblet to share the dangers of his friends. I know, Demetrius, how clever you are at chopping logic, and this, I believe, is why you will tender me some further advice, such as this. But you must not resort to those you have named, but to men with whom you have never had anything to do, and then your flight will be all right, for you will find it easier to lie hidden among people who do not know you. Well, let me examine this argument too, and see whether there is anything in it. For this is how I regard it. I consider that a wise man does nothing in private, nor by himself alone. I hold that not even his inmost thoughts can be so devoid of witness that he himself at least is not present with himself. And whether the Pythian inscription was suggested by Apollo himself, or by some man who had a healthy conscience, and was therefore minded to publish it as an aphorism for all, I hold that the sage who knows himself, and has his own conscience as his perpetual companion, will never cower before things that scare the many, nor venture upon courses which others would engage upon without shame. For being the slaves of despots, they have been ready, at times, to betray to them even their dearest, because just as they trembled at imaginary terrors, so they felt no fear where they should have trembled. But wisdom allows none of these things. For beside the Pythian epigram, she also praises Euripides, who regarded conscience in the case of human beings as a disease which works their ruin whenever they realize that they have done wrong. For it was such conscience that brought up before Orestes, and had depicted in his imagination the shapes of the Ammonites, when he had gone mad with wrath against his mother. For whereas reason decides what should be done, conscience revises the resolutions taken by reason. If then reason chooses the better part, conscience forthwith escorts a man to all the temples, into all the by-streets, into all groves of the gods, and into all haunts of mankind, applauding him and singing his praises. She will even hymn his merits as he sleeps, and will weave around him a chorus of angels from the world of dreams. But if the determination of reason trip and fall into evil courses, conscience permits not the sinner to look others in the face, nor to address them freely and boldly with his lips, and she drives him away from temples and from prayer. For she suffers him not even to uplift his hands in prayer to the images, but strikes them down as he lifts them, as the law strikes down those who rebel against it. And she drives such men from every social meeting, and terrifies them in their sleep. And while she turns into dreams and windy forms all that they see by day, and any things they think they hear or say, she lends to their empty and fantastic flutterings of heart truth and substantial reality of well-founded terror. I think, then, that I have clearly shown you, and that truth itself will convince you, that my conscience will convict me wherever I go, whether to people that know me, or to people that do not, supposing I were to betray my friends. But I will not betray even myself, but I will boldly wrestle with the tyrant, hailing him with the words of the noble Homer, "Mars is as much my friend as thine." Chapter 15. Damis was so impressed by this address, he tells us, that he took fresh resolution and courage, and Demetrius no longer despaired of Apollonius, but rather praising and agreeing with his appeal, wished Godspeed to him in his perilous enterprise, and to his mistress Philosophy, for whose sake he braved so much. And he led them, Damis says, to where he was lodging, but Apollonius declined, and said, "It is now eventide, and about the time of the lighting up of the lamps, and I must set out for the port of Rome, for this is the usual hour at which these ships sail. However, we will dine together another time, when my affairs are on a better footing, for just now some charge would be trumped up against yourself of having dined with an enemy of the emperor. Nor must you come down to the harbor with us, lest you should be accused, merely for having conversed with me, of harboring criminal designs." Demetrius accordingly consented, and after embracing them he quitted them, though he often turned back to look towards them and wiped tears from his eyes. But Apollonius looked at Damis and said, "If you are firmly resolved, and are as courageous as myself, let us both embark upon the ship. But if you are dispirited, it is better for you to remain here, for you can live with Demetrius during the interval, since he is as much your friend as mine." But Damis took him up and said, "What could I think of myself, if, after you have so nobly discoursed today about the duty of sharing the dangers of one's friends when they fall upon them, I let your words fall on deaf ears and abandoned you in the hour of danger, and this, although until now I have never shown cowardice where you were concerned?" Apollonius said, "You speak rightly, so let us depart. I will go as I am, but you must needs disguise yourself as a man of the people, nor must you wear your hair long as you do now, and you must exchange your philosopher's cloak for this linen garment, and you must put away the shoes you wear. But I must tell you what my intention is in this. For it were best to hold out as long as we can before the trial. Then I should not wish that you should be a sharer of my fate through being detected by your dress, which will certainly betray you and lead to your arrest. But I would rather that you followed me in the guise of one not sworn to my philosophy, but just attached to me for other reasons, and so accompanying me in all I do. This is the reason why Damis put off his Pythagorean garb, for he says he did not do it through cowardice, nor through any regret of having worn it, but merely because he approved of a device to which he accommodated himself to suit the expedients of the moment. Chapter 16. They sailed from Dicaearchia, and on the third day they put in to the mouth of the Tiber, from which it is a fairly short sail up to Rome. Now the emperor's sword was, at the time, in the keeping of Aelian, a person who long ago had been attached to Apollonius, because he once met him in Egypt. And although he said nothing openly in his favor to Domitian, for that his office did not allow of his doing, for how could he have praised to his sovereign's face one who was supposed to be an object of his detestation any more than he could intercede in his behalf as for a friend of his own? Nevertheless, whatever means there were of helping him in an unobtrusive way, he resorted to in his behalf, and accordingly, at the time when, before he arrived, Apollonius was being calumniated to Domitian, he would say, "My sovereign, sophists are all prattle and flippancy, and their art is all for show, and they are so eager to die because they get no good out of life, and therefore they don't wait for death to come of itself, but try to anticipate and draw it on themselves by provoking those who hold the sword." This, I think, was the reason which weighed with Nero, and prevented his being drawn on by Demetrius into slaying him. For as he saw that he was anxious for death, he let him off not because he wished to pardon him, but because he disdained to put him to death. Moreover, in the case of Musonius the Tyrrhenian, who opposed his rule in many ways, he only kept him in the island called Gyara, and Hellenes are so fond of these sophists, that, at that time, they were all making voyages by ship to visit him, as they now do to visit the spring. For until Musonius went there was no water in the island, but he discovered a spring, which the Greeks celebrate as loudly as they do the horse's spring at Helicon. Chapter 17. In this way Aelian tried to put off the king until Apollonius arrived, and then he began to use more address, for he ordered Apollonius to be arrested and brought into his presence. And when the counsel for the prosecution began to abuse him as a wizard and an adept at magic, Aelian remarked, "Keep yourself and your charges against him for the royal court." But Apollonius remarked, "If I am a wizard, how is it I am brought to trial? And if I am brought to trial, how can I be a wizard? Unless indeed the power of slander is so great that even wizards cannot get the better of it." Then, when the accuser was about to say something still more foolish, Aelian cut him off and said, "Leave me the time that will elapse until his trial begins, for I intend to examine the sophist's character privately, and not before yourselves. And if he admits his guilt, then the pleadings in the court can be cut short, and you can depart in peace. But if he denies his guilt, the emperor will try him." He accordingly passed into his secret court, where the most important accusations and causes were tried in strict privacy, and said to the company, "Do you depart hence, and let no one remain to listen, for such is the will of the emperor." Chapter 18. And when they were alone, he said, "I, O Apollonius, was a stripling at the time when the father of the present sovereign came to Egypt to sacrifice to the gods, and to consult you about his own affairs. I was a tribune only then, but the emperor took me with him, because I was already versed in war, while you were so friendly with myself, that when the emperor was receiving deputations from the cities, you took me aside and told me of what country I was, and what was my name and parentage. And you foretold to me that I should hold this office which is accounted by the multitude the highest of all, and superior to all other human positions at once, although to myself it means much trouble and much unhappiness. For I am the sentinel of the harshest of tyrants, whom, if I betray, I am afraid of the wrath of heaven. But I have shown you how friendly I am towards yourself,
for in reminding you how our friendship began, I have surely made it clear to you that I can never cease, as long as we can remember those beginnings. If I have said I would question you in private about the charges which your accuser has drawn up against you, it was only a good-natured pretext on my part for obtaining an interview with you, in order to assure you of my own good will, and to warn you of the emperor's designs. Now what his verdict will be in your case I do not know, but his temper is that of people who are anxious to condemn a person, but are ashamed to do so except upon some real evidence, and he wishes to make you an excuse for destroying these men of consular rank. So his wishes, you see, are criminal, but he observes a certain formality in his actions in order to preserve a semblance of justice. And I, too, in my turn, must pretend to be exasperated with you, for if he suspects me of any leniency, I do not know which of us will be the first to perish. Chapter 19. Apollonius replied, Since we are talking without any restraint, and you have told me all that is in your heart, I in turn am bound to tell you no less. And since you also take a philosopher's view of your own position, as one might do who has most thoroughly studied philosophy in my society, and, by heaven, inasmuch as you are so kindly disposed towards us as to imagine you run a common risk with myself, I will tell you exactly what I think. It was in my power to run away from you to many parts of the earth, where your authority is not recognized, and where I should have found myself among wise men, men much wiser than myself, and where I might have worshipped the gods in accordance with the principles of sound reason. I had only to go to the haunts of men who are more beloved of the gods than are the people of this city, men among whom such things as informers and writs of accusation are unknown, because, since they neither wrong one another nor are wronged, they stand in no need of law courts. But I am come to offer my defense, because I fear to be branded as a traitor. For, if I ran away instead of staying, and defending myself, those who are running risks on my account would be brought to ruin. But I would have you tell me, what are the accusations against which I have to defend myself? End of Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 13 through 19.